Good morning, CHD. It is Thursday, April the 17th, 2025, and we are live here for Financial Rebellion on CHD TV. Good morning, Catherine. Good morning, Carolyn.
Good morning, Polly.
Very excited about our guest today, but before we go to our guest, let's go to the headlines. What have we got today? Well, we've got the 1 in 31 kids had autism in 2022, up from 1 in 36 in 2020, which, by the way, means there's way more than that right now in 2025.
Right.
And
exactly.
So financially, this is a disaster for America.
Right. So it's a disaster for the families because you're talking about $1 to $5 million present value to take care of a heavily autistic kid. But then you're talking about costs to the school systems, the municipalities, and the country. And it's one of the reasons we see the HHS budget exploding. So this is a health disaster that converts into a financial disaster at the federal, state, local, and family level.
Okay, well, let's get on to our next headline. What have we got now? We have got 8 states weigh bills to establish or expand exemptions to school vaccine mandates. So Arizona is one of the 8 states that have introduced bills during the 2025 legislative session. So, Catherine, Carolyn, what do you have to say about that?
Well, back at the state level. Go ahead, Carolyn.
One of those states is not California, where the autism rates are much higher than the average, and coincidentally, they have no exemptions, and all the children in public schools have to have the vaccination. So,
yeah, what is it in California? Like 1 in
12 or something?
Right. The powers not reserved to the or delegated to the federal government by the states are reserved to the states, and that includes health care. So there is tremendous progress that can be made at the states, not just on health and food freedom, but it's got to be on financial transaction freedom, because if they get control of our financial transactions, then watch out, they can get control of all the health policies and reverse all these very good actions that people are taking.
Catherine, Carolyn, why, if it's 1 in 31, and we all know it's more, why is that not a national emergency? 1 in 31 Americans.
So it has to be, and I'll just talk about when a policy has a stated goal and the real goal is different, then what happens is the stated goal never gets accomplished. And you go along chronically saying, oh, something's wrong, we don't know what it is, et cetera, et cetera. But what it is evidence of is that there is a real goal. And so there is a poisoning going on in America. That poisoning is intentional. And, we could engage in conjecture about what the goal of the poisoning is, but it's intentional. And the reason it doesn't stop is it's intentional. And that's why families need to understand they cannot trust the government, they cannot trust the medical agencies, they cannot trust the doctors. It's your job to protect yourself and your family from being poisoned.
Well, the other thing is that the doctors are making a huge amount, the pediatricians in particular, are keeping their practices alive and profitable with the money from it. And so they have, and there are other payoffs by pharma. And people are susceptible to payoffs. I understand that one of the local counties has 20% of its children in its school are on IEPs. And now not all of those are autism, but IEPs are for children who are developmentally disabled. And neurologically disabled. So 1 in 5, they're paying for that. I had a client who had 2 autistic twins, and each of them had a full-time person who followed them through school. That's 2 salaries for 2 children.
Yeah, it's devastating, the whole thing. Well, Catherine, do you feel like we're going to get some knowledge on what it is that's causing the 1 in 31 children to become?
So I think there's plenty of knowledge about what is causing the neurological damage, but it needs to be that isn't to say it can't be organized and presented more effectively. And so I think we're in the process of making a breakthrough. And part of the reason we're making a breakthrough is that we're making breakthrough on multiple levels on different issues, not just on, what I call the great poisoning. People are moving to not trust the system in the way that they did and to take steps to create parallel capacity for things like health or food or whatever. So that is happening. The big obstacle, and we talked about this on Financial Rebellion before, to me is if you've had parents who have vaccinated their children, this is a very hard pill to swallow, to face the fact that you actively did something that harmed your child. And I think one of the big obstacles that to really a breakthrough on this issue is helping people face that fact and forgive themselves and get over it and move forward. So there's a turn in the general population and the polls that has to happen. And I think every effort we make at transparency and putting more science in front of people, I think there's a lot of science that tells us clearly the things that are harming and poisoning children. We just have to face it. And then there has to be a moment when you deal with the corporate infrastructure. It's one thing for the general population to face it. It's another thing to get the corporate infrastructure to change.
Yeah, and people are really losing faith in the whole system, and they're using the same playbook over and over again. Measles is out. Kids are dying from measles. Get your MMR. No one's buying any of it because everyone knows that those 2 children did not die of measles. And now whooping cough killed 2 babies. Did it? I don't think so. And where do we go with that? The lies are just from the mainstream media. People have had enough. They've had enough. So there's that. Now we've got one more. We've got Hero of the Week from Solari. Now, who have we got? Of course, we've got Leslie Manookian.
So Leslie Manookian, who runs the Health Freedom Fund and has done a great job in getting new legislation passed in Idaho that they can institute mandates at government agencies, schools, and private businesses. And this is something you can do for your state. You can go to the Idaho legislature, get a copy of the legislation, give it to your state representatives. Again, if you go to Solari, we have a great presentation called What States Can Do, and we have another one on how to get to know your state representatives. The action and the pushback is at the state level. It's so much fun. You get to meet people who love freedom. They're all piling in, they're all working on it. There's tremendous opportunity, and this is where the progress is being made. So, it's about one of my favorite songs is from Curtis Mayfield. He says, you don't need a ticket, you just get on board.
Thank you. Well, I think she's the perfect choice. She deserves every second of that.
Yeah.
Well, let's bring on our guest, shall we?
Yes. So I'm so pleased that Josh could join us today. We have Josh Stylman joining us. He has a great piece at his Substack called The Corporate Veil, and then he did a summary for those of us who wanted to, get the 411 before we dive in, called American LLC. Josh had a successful career in technology, then decided to reinvent himself, started a brewery in Manhattan or in Brooklyn that was quite successful, and then discovered himself at loggerheads with the crowd when he came out and spoke against the mandates during the pandemic. And that triggered, that's one of those magical moments when you say, reality and official reality are very different. And he started to dig in. I met him through Naomi Wolf up in the Hudson. And Josh has started to do research a couple years ago and has been writing in his Substack. And if you're not signed up for it, you want to be. It's remarkable material. And so before Josh, I just welcome you. I want to say his topic of the corporate veil and looking at sort of the deeper legal infrastructure of the United States. These are topics that have been discussed by many, many people trying to figure out what's going on in America and how we're moving to a technocratic form of government. But I've in every time in the last 20 years I've tried to read one of these pieces, generally I find them to be very incoherent, and Carolyn and I always end up tearing our hair out. And Josh went back and started with the 1871 Act and went through sort of all the different things they've been doing to build towards a more corporate or centrally controlled form of government, and published it. And it's remarkable. It's the most clear, coherent thing I've read so far. And I thought, oh, we have to get Josh on Financial Rebellion. One, I want everybody to know about him. You'll find remarkable material at his Substack. But the other thing is, this is the best explanation. What's happening to move us into a central control grid is not new. It started decades, if not a century ago. And so I think Josh can help us a lot by walking us through it. So Josh, first of all, welcome. And before we dive into your wonderful piece on the corporate veil, I want you to, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to ask Carolyn to do the term of the day, but I want to ask you, what was it like to wake up in the middle of the pandemic and realize the world was very different than you expected?
Surreal. And I'm not the only one who has been coming to some of these realizations. I always thought I was a critical thinker and a fairly discerning person. You know, I'm an entrepreneur, so I've always been a little bit against the grain and against the system, or so I thought. It's a friend of mine said it's sort of like pulling at a yarn on a sweater, and you keep pulling, the sweater unravels, then you realize the sweater was never actually there in the first place. And I started kind of a study group with some friends about 4.5 years ago at this point. Initially, it was concerned parents looking at mRNA technology, and we knew there would be pressure in our various cities for our children. And then we got to central bank digital currency, and then we realized as we kept pulling the layers back that we were a bunch of middle-aged men who actually don't know anything. We just know what we were told, which initially was harrowing and ultimately quite liberating.
I always say that facing that fact and the grief that comes with it is the doorway you have to walk through to get to real solutions. Yeah. So you entitled your long piece, The Corporate Veil. So before we dive in, Carolyn, why don't you explain to us traditionally, what does the corporate veil mean? It's our term for the day. Describe corporate veil to us.
Okay, and Lou, you're going to bring up something on that. A corporation is something separate from an individual, created for a business, and is actually a creature of state law. So a corporation comes into existence according to state law. And the whole purpose of a corporation, or the main purpose of a corporation, is that owners of a business can have personal non-liability for the corporate business, the liabilities of the corporate business. And there's certain things you have to do to establish a corporation and keep it separate from the individuals that own the corporation. And so in the law, in case law, there were cases that were talking about how people challenging the separateness of a corporation's debts from the owners so that they could get at the presumably rich owners who had more assets than the company. And the whole legal theory by which you tear down the existence of the corporation as a separate entity was called piercing the corporate veil. So when you talk about the corporate veil, you're talking about the separateness between a corporation and its owners for purposes of liability, primarily liability for its debts. And also for the assets. And a corporation files a different tax return from the individual. Now, that's as opposed to an LLC, which is something that was created since I graduated from law school, which will tell you how old I am. There wasn't an LLC when I came, at least not widespread when I was in law school. But LLC is sort of a hybrid because it does allow you to have, it has no personal liability liability of the owners if you keep it up, but it also means that you can file on, it can be a see-through entity for tax purposes, and you don't have to have the double taxation that you have with the corporation. So you can do it, you can file a Schedule C for an LLC.
Okay, so Josh, tell us how you came to write Corporate Fail. What inspired you to do it?
Well, and by the way, thank you for having me on. I'm a huge fan of CHD and the show, and of you personally, as you well know. So I should probably also say that your average listener probably has a better understanding of legal and financial matters than I do. I'm just a guy who knows how to search the internet, and I sort of like finding puzzle pieces and figuring out how they might snap together. So, as we go through, I'll try to be as concise as I can, but the piece was like 12,000 words. I wrote the you alluded to specifically for my mother, who I knew wouldn't read it and would inevitably call me and ask me to explain it. I guess I got started in writing this. I came across some random video on Twitter that talked about this 1871 act that sounded very mysterious and supposedly established 3 city-states. In Washington, D.C., London, and the Vatican, that supposedly were under sovereign, their own sovereign entities separate from their locale. So I was intrigued and started immediately devouring content around this. I got cautious quickly because it seemed a little too sensational. It was one of those things like, why doesn't everybody know this if this is a real thing? This wasn't something that happened in 2023, right? This was, since well before any of us were born. I also found that there were a lot of rabbit holes with some seemingly sketchy off-ramps. People telling you could resign your citizenship and things of that nature that immediately got my radar going. It kind of felt like it was going to the second Matrix. So, I reached out to a bunch of people I knew, including a bunch of attorneys who I was sure would know something about this. Few people had heard of it. They were all pretty dismissive and said it wasn't something I should worry about, and not to pay much attention. So,
can I just stop you for a second? Anybody in the financial markets knows that the independence of the Vatican and London are very, very significant and important.
Yep.
And powerful.
Yep, and right. lots of ties to international banking,
right?
in all 3 of these spots. So I kept digging. I found this book by a guy named E.C. Knuth. I think that's how I pronounce his name, Knuth, called Empire of the City. It was written in the 1940s. It was short. At first, it was a little hard to find. I looked the other day, and there seem to be copies now in bookstores online. They're all like, it's not cheap for like a little paperback, but meticulously documented, extensive citations from the congressional record, and lots of other primary sources. It was sort of something like you or Whitney Webb would put out. Like, he just sort of showed his work and said, okay, go for it. So, the book, for me, it pointed out that Washington, D.C., the City of London, and the Vatican were all clearly operating as sovereign entities with very special legal carve-outs. I won't get into all the minutiae of the detail, but very separate from the countries that they live in. They have separate flags. They are all their own entity. And these weren't random places. These are the financial, spiritual, and military centers with tons of international banking interests tied to them, and lots of very well documented financial transactions through the 20th century. So, so I guess my takeaway after reading that was that the video that got me interested in this wasn't precisely right. It wasn't that we just bent the knee in 1871 and we've been operating under some foreign power. It was even more interesting. It was not this sudden takeover, but this slow, incremental, methodical restructuring that's happened over generations and hiding in plain sight. So, starting the 1871 thing was still interesting because DC was reorganized as a municipal corporation at that point. And I'm sure Carolyn will point out all the things I'm getting wrong here, by the way. So, but it as I understand it, it's a municipal corporation with powers to contract and be contracted with, to sue and be sued. So that's particularly interesting when you think about the timing of it. So it's right after the Civil War, right after America was, deeply indebted to all these international banking interests. We have this carve out in the nation's capital. So, there's a lot more details that follow. Like we can keep this, I'm happy to walk through as much detail on this as you want, or we can keep kind of going back and forth.
So one of the reasons I wanted to cover this, Josh, is I see we're about to publish its Leary report, or we just published last night, a detailed list of all the different things the new administration has done to implement the digital control grid. And it's extraordinary, and it goes across many different items in many different parts of the government, but it's coming together at high speed. But if you look at that list and then you compare it to your article, what you see is, these train tracks have been, we've been building these train tracks for a long, long time. And many of those train tracks come up as you go through the different history. So I do want to go through a chronology, because I think, you are talking about moving from a government that's sort of a representative republic to a much more corporate infrastructure. And it's done over time, and it's done very subtly. So I do think I would love to go through the timeline if you're willing.
Yeah, and maybe I could just spend a few minutes and give some highlights. So,
okay.
I don't want to bore with. There's so many tedious details, and I encourage. And again, I put this out knowing I would be wrong about a bunch of stuff. I probably missed a bunch of stuff. My hope is this is open sourced and people can build on it. People can correct it. It's already happened in the comment section on my Substack, which has been great. So,
well, but let me just interrupt you for a second, because I'm constantly asked who's really in control. And it's by understanding this legal and financial infrastructure that you start to get at the issue of seeing how control really works.
Yep.
So if you are interested in who's really in control, because clearly it's not the president, it's very, very important to understand these things. Anyway, so go ahead.
Oh, it's Mr. Global, I thought.
Well, but Mr. Global needs, he needs the train tracks, he needs the levers, he needs the mechanical and legal infrastructure to control and manipulate.
Yep. So I put through on the piece a pretty detailed timeline, but I guess just for a few key headlines, just to sort of set up some of the train tracks. So there was this case called the Santa Clara County case, which established the notion of corporate personhood. That's a really, it gets into there's sort of a setup for what some of Carolyn was talking about in terms of LLC protections and decoupling and all that stuff. So by 1906, there was a Supreme Court case called Hell versus Henkel, which explicitly distinguished between natural persons and corporations as what they call creatures of the state. So they're basically saying that people like you and me have inherent rights that existed before the government was formed, and corporations only have whatever rights the government decides to give them. So that's a pretty key distinction. As we go through, I'm sure your audience is familiar with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, when we transferred our monetary system from elected officials to these private banking interests. So the Jekyll Island meeting seems particularly important in that it brought together these international bankers who represented, I think, like a quarter of the world's whole wealth, meeting in secret that totally redesigned our monetary systems. And nothing sketchy about that at all. That all happened, and I think this is really important, particularly in the context of the last few years. I keep talking to some really smart people and a lot of the COVID dissidents who think there was a coup in 2020. And I keep pointing, and this is one of the reasons I like sort of going back and seeing what the elite said a century ago, because this all happened, at least the Fed, for example, under the watch of Woodrow Wilson. Right. So if you go back and look at Wilson, who, by the way, seems to have been under the thumb of a bureaucrat named Colonel Edward House, who is someone that I had never heard of till a few years ago. He seemingly was running things behind the scenes and probably somewhat of a handler for Wilson, though he never had an official government job, which is also very interesting. So in studying House, I found a novel that he wrote called Philip Drew Administrator. He published it anonymously. And House basically lays out his dream for America, which was a socialist dictatorship run by experts instead of elected officials. So does that sound familiar at all?
Yeah, it's a technocracy.
Yes.
Yeah.
In his private papers, House went so far as to say that he was the power behind the throne invisible to the public. So this is a guy who's got banking interests, and now we see that colliding with the administrative control. It's everything you talk about on the show regularly. So I think some other important details, certainly that take us to present day, creation of the IRS and Social Security system. So again, these are presented, all these things, like sort of like everything we get from our governments, it's always presented as a public benefit. These things fundamentally alter the relationship between citizens and the state. So Social Security.
I want to point one thing out. So, and you pointed out in your article that Edwin Vieira had said, the combination of the IRS and Social Security create a mathematical identification system that can be used for many purposes. But if you look at creating the IRS, creating Social Security, and creating the Fed controls the Treasury's bank account. Okay, they're the depository for the U.S. Treasury. If you look at the DOGE initiative in the new administration, the first thing they went for is not the areas reputed to have significant fraud. They went to get and privatize the IRS data, the Social Security data, and the Treasury bank account data. I don't know if you noticed that extraordinary alignment with your description of what happened in 1913.
I did. And you have forgotten more about all this stuff than I'll presumably ever know. But I think for me, one of the big things, and you and I have talked about this before, it's sort of, I think part of the problem with all this stuff is you start to see how interconnected these changes are, right? And, people tend to specialize in their own domain. So I asked a lawyer about 1871, or I asked, a banker about a particular thing. They're only focused on those silos, right? And same with government experts. So I like to I keep thinking, and as I keep thinking I'm having these breakthroughs and figuring stuff out, and then I widen the aperture, and I'm like, oh no, I don't actually understand any of this. Keep needing to go wider, right? So you and Carolyn both met my friend Mark Schiffer, who wrote wonderful manifesto on pattern recognition. And I think part of the thing that he and I and the rest of our group look at are not how any one of these silos work, but how they all work in tandem with one another. Right. So, the legals stay in their legal lane, the bankers stay in their banker lane. And we've been conditioned to dismiss any one of these things without academic or institutional validation, and it becomes a conspiracy theory. But if you keep zooming out, forget about, that Mark likes to talk about forgetting about consensus and only think about coherence. And you have to think about how these multi-factors work in tandem with one another. And again, there's no, if you can read my 12,000 words, there's no smoking gun here. Just like there's no smoking gun in all the stuff you've been talking about with DOGE. But if you look at the pattern and you apply this framework of understanding how these systems work in concert with one another, there's an obvious trend. And the trend is technocratic systems are taking over, and people are losing their basic human rights. And subsequently, if this plays out, any semblance of human dignity.
So one of the things I want to bring up, which I think is very important, because I was really pleased to see the focus you gave on the Supreme Court giving rights of personhood to a corporation. But here's what's interesting. If you look at a person, so you or me, if we create murder, then we can go to jail for the rest of our lives or even be subject to the death penalty. But there's no prison or death penalty for corporations. Now, they're fines. But increasingly, particularly after the financial crisis, a kickback to the government, which is a percent of your profits, and you're good. So we've literally created serial felons and serial criminals. So the corporate, and we're watching in the corporate world more and more business models being turned to integrate financial fraud as a stated corporate goal. Because in fact, corporations can murder with impunity and do.
I mean, let's look at the last few years. They have not only with impunity, but they've done it with products that are funded by taxpayer dollars.
Right. Now, here's what's interesting. As Carolyn said, corporations are a creature of the state, which means any state in the United States can pull the license to operate. right?
Right.
So in fact, there is a way to have a death penalty for a corporation, at least within your jurisdiction. And
Well,
yet,
it's a way to effectively pierce the corporate veil. You can hold individual officers or even employees of a corporation liable for things they do allegedly in the name of the corporation. So it does not necessarily mean that just because you're doing it in the name of a corporation that you can't be held liable for murder. It's just that the corporation isn't something you can put in a jail cell. So you have to go through the corporation to get to the employee or officer in order to find somebody liable for that type of crime.
right, but since the financial crisis, it's a rare moment when any corporate officer is held legally responsible for anything the
Absolutely.
corporation does. Right, and now what we're seeing is a push for more indemnification. So we have the pesticide makers pushing hard to get indemnification for any harm their pesticides do. So,
Right. Can I just say something in my skeptical lawyer mode? I see completely what you're saying about personhood being attributed to the corporation. And what I learned is you want, for purposes of certain laws, for a corporation to be a person in order to hold them liable for things. I personally do not believe it works the other way around. And I don't think that under the Uniform Commercial Code, a birth certificate is a chattel paper, which apparently is the argument that some people have that somehow the government has a lien on human beings. I just don't believe a court of competent jurisdiction would hold that a human being is chattel, that a birth certificate is chattel paper just because the registration system is similar to the commercial.
so
But
I'm gonna take the other side of that. Because we've seen enormous games going on in the collateral system and collateral fraud. And if you look at the extent of the fraud in the collateral system, I would say anything is possible. We don't know if this is or is not. But I would also say if you look at municipal financing, the municipal financing and the country have a draw on the ad valorem taxes and the property of every individual. And if you look at what they can do to grab or demand taxes or the property, that's not the same as having the person as chattel, but it gets pretty close as a practical matter.
Well, there definitely are constitutional issues, however, because slavery is recognized as not valid under the Constitution. But there's a difference between de jure and de facto, and de jure is according to the law, and de facto is the way it really works. And I think that much of what Josh has pointed out is that de jure isn't the same thing as de facto, and we do live under a de jure system where things happen that theoretically under the law aren't supported. And I also want to say, Josh, that you did a great job. I keep hearing people talk about sovereign citizenship, and I've just never understood what they're talking about. And we get questions all the time about some of the matters that you deal with, and I've never understood where the 1871 law came in. And I now realize that's just the law that creates the District of Columbia, where I lived. And I would say there are reasons for the way it works, and I don't personally think it applies to the whole United States. It just applies to D.C. But I really applaud you for making understandable to somebody like an attorney what the other people are talking about. And I think you've made a lot of really valid points. And one thing that I hope someone will write about is the Uniform Commercial Code. It is so complex, it's horrible. But I think the Uniform Commercial Code is going in the direction of what you're talking about, taking away individual rights, particularly as to property and holding of securities and digital assets. And that's a very interesting topic. But I think probably only an attorney is competent to really. I'm not competent to talk about the Uniform Commercial Code. So somebody who hasn't had to take it for courses in law school, it was going to have a really hard time understanding it.
So I want to get back to basics for a second, because I want to get back to children, because our name here is Children's Health Defense. And I want to draw the connection to kids. So one of the last financial rebellions, we talked about the popsicle index. And Josh, I don't know if you've ever heard of the popsicle index, but it was something I created when I was in the government. The popsicle index is the percent of people in a community who believe a child can leave their home, go to the nearest place to buy a popsicle, and come home alone safely. And so when I was a little girl, the popsicle index in West Philadelphia was 100%. It was just unthinkable that you couldn't be free to roam during the day. And during my lifetime, the S&P index has gone up, and the popsicle index has gone down, down, down. So we had a financial rebellion where we talked about it. But it seems to me that if you look at the history you're describing in the corporate veil, the more of these corporate rules and technocratic things we put into place, the easier it is to get the stock market to go down while the popsicle index, stock market to go up while the popsicle index is going down. And one of the reasons is if you map out money and the financial system on a county level in America, a lot of that is engineered through government money, including secret government money and money that's not properly financially disclosed. So you're building a legal and financial infrastructure that essentially gets you to extract wealth from the economy in a way that shrinks the total pie. It just centralizes control.
So we spent a lot of time talking about NATO.
Somebody said NATO?
Sorry, no, I was looking up the popsicle index and then clicked on something. Sorry about that.
So you probably got the story of Palantir getting a new contract from NATO.
Oh, I saw that.
Speaking of a popsicle index going down further.
Yeah.
So talk to us about children. How do you think this growth of corporations has affected children and communities?
Well, I think what we're seeing is the manifestation of fiat systems, right? So I put that,
right.
WTF happened in 1971.
Mm-hmm.
Chart. Famous, decoupling.
That chart is amazing. Can we look at that chart? I fell off my chair when I saw it.
Yeah, so I found this a few years ago, and it's from a wonderful website called WTF Happened in 1971, right? And it just talks. It's essentially growth in productivity and hourly compensation since 1948. You see a steady flow together with productivity and compensation, and then a dramatic decoupling, right?
That was an amazing chart.
Yeah, and its productivity keeps going up and compensation grows at a very disproportionate rate. So there it is. And
that is phenomenal.
I can't take credit for this chart. I found it, and it's remarkable. So I think this directly ties to the popsicle index, and it directly ties to, when you have an entirely fake economy that is clearly propped up in an entirely fake world with fake wars and fake medicines and, fake news and everything else. And, I am encouraged, with some of Polly's opening remarks that people are starting to realize this, myself included, that, we can't pay attention to some of these expert analyses that, the economy is great or, whatever the study is, insert here. What we're seeing is that these are all illusory techniques. And no, anyone with eyes can, I moved from New York City, the Hudson Valley. It was very evident that after a nice run of prosperity, the streets felt different. And as a parent, I didn't feel safe having my kids walk around. So in my lovely little pocket of the city, it's New York. So there's always weird people walking around, but it was, more interesting than scary. And something clearly shifted in the last few years. So I think we're seeing, anyone with the capacity or maybe even courage to see it can see with their own eyes that the popsicle index is falling no matter what, the Dow is telling you. And that,
right.
When one would have to ask why. Now you can chart that. I imagine the popsicle index is probably more correlated to things like American health and obesity and autism and all the other things you talk about on the show than it is any financial metrics.
Oh, but here's the thing. if you are going to do this, you need a way of using secret or government money to make an economic process look economic for Wall Street. So let me give you an example. So I wrote a book called Dillon Read and the Aristocracy of Stock Profits, and I use as a case study the private prison business. So in 1996, it cost $154,000 per year to put one person in the prison system. And if you had them, on HUD housing and welfare, it would cost you maybe $55,000 a year. So moving them out of subsidized housing into prison was unbelievably expensive. And yet we created a whole private prison business and made it look profitable, with Wall Street making a lot of money and private prison companies making a lot of money, by exploding the cost to taxpayers in a way that was highly uneconomic. So the corporations are making money, the construction firms are making money, the private prison companies are making money, the investors are making money, and the taxpayers are also being put in tax prison. Because it's we're talking about Soviet economics. And so this whole thing depends on a corporate state that can use taxpayers' money in a way that is highly uneconomic and wasteful. And it started when the bankers got control of monetary policy, as you described. But if you look at the building of the control grid now they're trying to get control of fiscal policy. And that's what you need to keep this going, because you're talking about taxation without representation to keep a highly uneconomic system subsidized.
Yeah, not to go too off topic, but there's a whole other track around the culture that's built on these illusions. So I did a long piece called Engineering Reality that got into some of these mechanisms. And one of the things I talked about was how the hip hop labels are also were owned by the same people who own the private prisons. So they sort of create these role models, and they prop themselves up so young people think that a particular lifestyle is worthwhile and therefore follow suit, and then they can populate their private prisons. So it's
right.
If it wasn't so sinister, you'd have to admire the genius in it. It's impossibly evil. But no,
Right.
As back to these mechanisms, I think, back to what Carolyn said, for example, about 1871, it's not like any one of these things are like, oh, here we go, and this is, we're led to the control grid. This is all a progression, and it's happening, and it's like, all the things that I laid out now, over 150 years, we're now seeing, like, all the things you talk about, Real ID and Stargate and digital finance orders. It seems like we're now seeing them sort of at warp speed, pun intended.
Right.
And, all the things you've been talking about on the show are being put in turbocharged in a few weeks, really. I mean, once you realize that, the paper records and manual processing can now be done with digital databases and algorithms charged with AI, and, your point about, Social Security data, IRS data being sucked in with these incredibly powerful systems, I don't think, especially the quote people on our side that are so caught in these dialectical games, understand the power that systems can suck in, and that ultimately, I don't care who's in power, these systems they're completely insane.
Right.
One other point I want to make sure we get to, just about some of the framework I laid out, because we touched on it, but I want to make sure anyone who's listening understands. The dual identity system is really important. So we talked about it from the context of protections for the corporations. There's the inverse, I think, is worth touching on just for a minute, which is just the notion of that each of us does exist in two forms. So there's like natural flesh and blood people, like all of us here, with inherent rights and natural rights. And then there's the legal person that the system interacts with. So if you look at, your birth certificate, your driver's license, your social security card, all things that didn't exist for our great-great-grandparents, I should add, there's the same convention in that they're all in capital letters. And I'd be particularly interested in Carolyn's take on this from a legal perspective, because, I'm a longtime entrepreneur. I know when you write out the name of a corporation, it's written in capitals. It never occurred to me until I started doing this research that why is my driver's license and my social security card written in capitals? So the implication, and I don't know if this is right, but the implication is that the system has created a corporate version that it's dealing with rather than me as a person or you as a person. So did I completely miss the boat on that?
Well, I have never been aware of any, I look at precedents and I look at case law and I look at statutes, and that's what the law is, as opposed to the way we do things. And I have never come across anything that indicates, I was never told that you should put a corporation's name in capitals. I mean, that's the way contracts that you copy and change for the next guy, it's uncapped, so you put the name of the corporation in capitals. So I'm not sure that in court would be an argument just that it is in capital letters. It is an interesting concept, though, and I never noticed that. But there is the thing that I think is interesting is the idea that you want something separate from you to prove who you are, so that you could have biometric information or a number or a record somewhere that someone will use to prove you are who you are, and it really isn't you. So there's all sorts of opportunities for identity theft, and you're arguing, wait a minute, I know who I am. I'm not that person, but the digital records indicate that something else is you. That is a really scary prospect to me.
So, and let me bring something else up, which is the Bank of International Settlements has created an inventory of all the assets on the planet and is in the process of creating tokens for every asset on the planet, so that we not only have a representation of each person, but we have a representation of every asset, and presumably one that can be traded and financially liquefied. So you can check out at the grocery store and pay your groceries with, 0.0001% of your house.
Yeah, and the thing that I find the most scary about the system that is envisioned is the idea that we could have homes, for example, real property in the digital, transfer property digitally. Because now the way it is that you have a deed and you go to a local recording office and you can search back to the Revolutionary War or earlier to find out who owned that property, and short of something fraudulently filed, you've got proof of ownership. But if it's all digital, all that has to happen is the digits are changed and all of a sudden you don't own the property. So I find that to be very, very much of a land grab, potential
right.
land.
And particularly because of the fraud we've seen in the collateral system.
Right.
So Josh, I want to talk a little bit about what you're working on now, but before we do, is there more you would like to describe about the corporate veil?
No, again, it's a really long piece, and I think, even just getting into some headlines barely does the idea justice. And again, I welcome criticism. The point was, I don't know, and I don't think any of us know. It's interesting to me because of where we are at this particular moment right now, right? So we've got this infrastructure that has been set up over the last, call it 100, 150 years. I wrote another really long piece called The Technocratic Blueprint that similarly looks at the trajectory of some of what we're seeing now of the technocracy that was laid together, over the last 100 so odd years. And again, if you look at the words very specifically of the people putting these systems in place, they had very clear intent. And I think all the work you've been doing and everything you talk about on the show matters right now more than ever, particularly while, and again, I'm totally uninterested in bipartisan politics. Because I think it's just a distraction that sucks our energy. And that's not to say it doesn't matter, because we know it does, and we know we need to be active. And, people like Leslie, who are the hero of the day, are proving that, certainly at the local level.
So when I first met you, one of the things I said, so Polly and Carolyn and I have been discussing on the health issue, how do we get parents to realize how dangerous some of the pharmaceutical and vaccine treatments are, and make a change. And part of that is facing the fact that what you've been doing has been poisoning your kids. And you know, you need to you need to face that, you need to forgive yourself, you need to change. What can we do? And that gets into the whole notion of mind control and disinformation. And one of the things I said to you is we really need researchers and authors to dig in and understand what we need to do to help people sort of see the truth and not get tricked, not fall prey to the propaganda and the mind control. So I know you're working on a series, and I was wondering if you would just give us a few words about what you're up to and when we can look for this.
Yeah, and first off, apologies. I don't know what happened. I got knocked offline and it wasn't going back on. Yeah, so on the point, what you were saying in the opening remarks really, really resonated with me in terms of particularly parents. I think it's a human reaction to have, cognitive dissonance is a real thing. No one wants to admit or acknowledge they did the wrong thing, particularly as it relates to hurting their children. So I wrote a thing a couple of weeks ago called The Prison of Certainty, where I get into some of these details. And you can apply it to vaccines. You can apply it to some of the gender-affirming care stuff. I mean, once people make these life-altering or possibly permanent decisions for their children, and then, pose with it on their social media, and it becomes tethered to their identity, how can they possibly turn around and say they screwed up? So I don't know. I'm just a person who's wired a little bit differently, and I need to own the fact that I make lots of mistakes. I have a kid who was diagnosed with Crohn's colitis a few years ago. My wife and I now believe he's probably that probably was we did the timeline only retrospectively and realized it was right after he was vaccinated. And it may have had a bad reaction. And we look inward and say, no, we have to accept this, because if we don't accept what happened, how could we possibly course correct? So, as I think we all need to face the reality of sort of where we are.
I agree with that 100%. I just want to say that he's right, but here's the thing. So I was him, I vaccinated my children. Obviously, everyone knows what happened there, but you have to realize you were lied to. That's the bottom line, is you were lied to. Forget the fact that we were trusting blinkered people and didn't do our own research. Bottom line is you expect to go to a doctor. On the whole, you expect to go to a doctor, and the doctor's there for your best interest and is going to help you with your child. So I think once you realize that you were lied to, it's much easier to go out there publicly and say, hey, hang on a minute, I trusted you and you hurt my child, so I'm now going to fight back. That makes you the person in a much more powerful position where you don't have to sitting around apologizing, drinking yourself to death because you just messed up your child. Just go with the fact that you were lied to, and we're going to put that right before someone else gets hurt.
That's right.
Sorry. Go, Josh.
I was going to say, sorry, I don't know I could hear every word of that. I don't know what was going on here. You said something to me, Catherine, the first time we met, that mind control was the root of all of it. And you gave me this wonderful book by a woman named Carla Emery, and I had been researching in parallel to that. So to your direct question, I've been working on a big 4-part thing about mind control, kind of writing up some of the notes that some friends and I have been going through over the last 4 years, looking at it through progression. And you'll see hopefully I'll release the first one the next week or so, and then probably every two.
I can't wait.
I'm very curious in particular about your feedback, because I know you studied it. I try to do it in a way that is rooted in receipts and history, kind of like this piece, but I take some more speculative leaps to things that people may not have thought about and that might be really controversial. Stuff like mass trauma incidents and things of that nature. So I don't know. It's a little, tried to make it a little more accessible for regular people using pop culture as a thread. So you'll be the judge when it comes out.
Okay. Well, tell us how to find your Substack.
It's just my last name, Stylman.substack.com.
Okay.
I'm on Twitter, J Stylman. And although I'm finding that I'm increasingly shadow banned there, despite the supposed.
Why am I not surprised?
Congratulations. Congratulations. You're having an effect if you're shadow banned.
Yeah.
Badge of honor.
Yeah, it's a badge of honor. Well, Josh, I can't thank you enough for joining us on Financial Rebellion. I hope after you get this new piece series out, you can come back and join us again for another conversation, because I think, anything we can all do to sort of break through the trance and help each other break through the trance is so very important. So I'm really glad that you've decided to take this on. Pauline, Carolyn, any other thoughts for Josh before he leaves?
Well, no, I just want to thank you so much, Josh, for all the work you're doing, and welcome to our world. Our team, our movement is ever growing, and we're very happy to have you there and to learn more from you. So thank you for everything.
Well, thank you all. I've learned a ton from each one of you and really appreciate the time, and apologies for the connectivity issues.
And I'd like to thank you in your articles for actually hyperlinking to the original primary documents, because so many times you read articles and they refer to something, and if you know how to do legal research, sometimes you can find it, but having a link to all of those things was really helpful. And thank you and also sort of bridging the gap between the legal people and the non-legal people, because it's helpful for the legal people to understand what the other people are saying. And if you can't speak in really concrete terms and give us some primary documents, we don't know what to do with the theories.
Well, I'm a non-legal person, so I don't know how I could possibly bridge any gaps, but glad it was useful. So
you did a pretty good job.
Well, thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thank you to you, Josh, and also Carolyn and Catherine for another really great show. And we'll be back next week. And pray big, my friends. Stand firm, never settle. And we'll see you soon. A lovely family with us this morning.
Hello.
Hello, and you're the Stephen family?
Yes.
And your names are?
Clint. My name is LaCosta. I go by Sam.
Sam.
This is Samantha.
Samantha.
And what's your name? Maddox.
Okay, nice to see you. All right, let's hear the story.
We had Maddox in 2012, and we went just from the hospital, and we got every vaccine that was recommended for him. That first
question it or?
No, I think in my gut I questioned it, and we kind of talked to our doctor about autism risk, but he quickly diffused it for us. Just like, that's just science that proves.
The first kid, you think the doctors know the best,
Yeah. And we worked in the medical field. We just never questioned anything. But like I said, I had a gut feeling.
So when you say you worked in a medical field, in what way?
I did admin stuff, or I still do. I do work in practice, hospital management, and he's an electrician, and a commercial electrician. So that's where we actually met, is at the hospital we worked for. But Maddox had the normal schedule of vaccines. And over the course of that first year, there were some illnesses that required antibiotics, ear infection, strep throat, multiple doses of Tylenol and ibuprofen. When he received his MMR, the day he received it, was the day after his first birthday. And I remember talking to the doctor that day and telling him that he had, because they kind of go through their milestones with you at the doctor's appointment, checking and seeing, are they walking, are they talking? And I think we said he had 20 to 30 words at one. And quickly, within a week or two after that MMR, there were no immediate symptoms, no seizures, no fevers. We started noticing that he wasn't speaking anymore. No mama, no dada, no, not even the word no, like the words that he had been saying since he was 10 months old. And we're gearing up for his 15-month appointment. And one of the things that kind of validated the speech regression for us, because other people weren't around him so much that they noticed it, is a lady that worked at his daycare had left right before his first birthday. And when she came back, or she had came back shortly before he was 15 months old, and we had been talking to the doctor about his speech regression. And when we went and picked him up at daycare that day, the lady was there, and she was like, wasn't Maddox talking before I left? And this was somebody else who had spent months with my child, knew my child, probably spent just as much time we had with him, because she had him since he was 6 weeks old. And then she spent a period of time separated from him, so she kind of validated, yeah, there is a speech regression. I've noticed it. About this time, we get pregnant with our second child, and Maddox, we expressed the concerns to our doctor, and he tells us that was normal for boys to regress in speech after 1 and to start making grunts and groans and kind of caveman noises.
So let's just get that straight. It is normal for a boy to regress after 1,
yes,
make grunting noises,
and quit speaking, but start more of a caveman type phase.
I mean, we're in a bad place when doctors say that.
Yeah. At 15 months, he received his varicella vaccine and his first ever flu shot.
15 months is his vaccines and his first flu shot.
Yeah. Was that his first flu shot? Or no, I think the year before he had one, but we didn't do the booster. I think at 6 months he had one.
He had a flu shot at 6 months.
I'm not completely positive about that one, but I know he had one at 15 months.
Okay.
And he had diarrhea for like 2 or 3 weeks after that. We kept taking him back to the doctor, and there was no known reason. And finally, he admitted that sometimes the flu shot can kind of destroy your gut bacteria a little bit, but he'll be fine. Don't give him any dairy, and I think that's when we started him on almond milk. We still gave him dairy, like cheeses and stuff. When she was born, we decided to not go with the normal schedule. We were still scared about certain diseases like pertussis, whooping cough. So we decided we declined all vaccines at the hospital, but at 2 months we decided we were going to do DTaP with her. And I'll pick up more on Maddox in a second, but we did DTaP with her at 2 months. And at 2 months, he got his second flu shot. He got a booster.
So he was how old when he got his booster?
She was 2 months. He was 2.
See, about 17, 18 months.
Yeah, because the doctor said he needed a second one.
I don't understand why
it hadn't even been a year.
Why having so many flu shots and such little children. I don't understand that.
And we just went right with him, like, okay. And I didn't even do flu shots myself.
So he had one at a year. He had a flu shot
at 15 months,
15
and then
months,
again
and
at 2. So it hadn't even been a year. And she had immediately, right away, we just did that one vaccine with her because we were already suspicious that the MMR had caused his regression.
And let's make this absolutely clear. These are not baby flu shots. They're not reduced. These are the same flu shots that give to fully grown adults.
I believe so.
Yes.
I believe so. And right away, she got a little bit of eczema on her face. So at 2 months, she was 2 months old. We got her DTaP, which she had a reaction to on her face with the eczema. At the same appointment, we talked to the doctor about his regression. And he said, well, let's do some... Sorry. He said, let's do some speech and hearing tests. Was it? Yeah, 2 months. We decided to have his hearing tested and his speech because she was a little baby when we went and had his.
He was close to 2.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. So we went and had that testing done. Hearing test was normal. They couldn't really evaluate speech because there was no speech at 2. Again, we get her another Tdap at 4 months, and then another one at 6 months. And by then, her face was oozing and bleeding. Her face, she looked like a burn victim. And that's when we said, we're stopping. 100%. His last shot was that flu shot, and then her last shot was that third DTaP shot. And still at that time, my chiropractor had recommended a detox for him. It had some low-level chelators, and we started that about 2.5 And right away, his speech exploded as soon as we got maybe 2 weeks into that treatment. But he would still have meltdowns that would last 3 hours. He would hurt himself. He would try to hurt us. I'm over 200 pounds, and I couldn't hold him down. He would overpower me with his with these fits he would have. And I think the hardest part was we thought he was just at some point just being a bad kid, I was thinking, in the middle of a fit, I'm supposed to help him and protect him, and here I'm trying to get him to calm down because I'm thinking he's part of it's just being bad and rotten, and I'm not disciplining him enough. She's 1, he's 3, and this is when we tell our doctor no more vaccines because she hadn't been seen since 6 months. And we're talking to him about Maddox. Well, the first thing he said about her, she needed her MMR, and measles could kill her.
She was MMR what?
He was trying to talk us into getting her MMR. And I said, no, not after what happened with my son. And he said, well, measles could kill her. And I said, well, so could a staph infection or MRSA. And we work at a hospital, and who knows what we're bringing home with us. And she's got open sores on her face. So that was the more immediate concern with her, with the reaction she was having. And he admitted that the eczema and the sores were potentially a side effect to those DTaps. And then with Maddox, we talked about his regression. At 3, he was speaking okay, but he was still having his meltdowns. And he had, before that, told us to isolate him. Oh, he's just throwing a temper tantrum. You need to isolate your child. Put him in his room for a minute. We put him in his room, and he would turn that room upside down. He'd be in there screaming and crying for 2 hours. He'd lost all control of his emotions. And we explained that to his doctor, the pediatrician we have had for the first 3 years. And he said, well, some children are predisposed to autism. And he said, sometimes the MMR vaccine or a vaccine can bring that out. But it would have happened anyway. If he got sick or if he experienced any kind of trauma, once he had the flu or an illness, that would have brought the autism out too. So I said, wouldn't it have been better though if those things, what if he never got sick and that wouldn't have brought it out? Wouldn't it have been better if he established all his milestones and established speech before we had ever injected him? We were still struggling with meltdowns, and we decided at that point we need a new doctor. We don't need to be taking our kids. We need somebody that's going to help our child and be on the same page with us. By this point, we were both a team here. We definitely weren't going to do any more vaccinations. We also have our 3rd child on the way that will be 100%.
Right now?
Right now.
Baby coming.
Baby coming.
When's your baby due?
January 13th.
Oh.
14th.
Yes.
Okay, good stuff. And you know what to do?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we're
Stay away from everyone.
Yeah. So, Maddox, I think what really made us seek further help. So this doctor's hitting that he's got nonverbal autism, and he's wanting us to see a neurologist and get a formal diagnosis. And working in the medical field and insurance, I didn't want to go. I kind of balked at that diagnosis. I didn't want that on file with the insurance. I didn't want to have to go through behavioral health because, I felt it was a medical condition. I'm not going to go through behavioral health and ABA therapy. Something, this was triggered by a medical procedure. We need somebody that's going to help him. And New Year's this year, 10 months ago, he's still having his meltdown. 9.5 months ago, I went on a trip to see my mother, and he had been doing okay, but because we were out of town, he was out of his element, out of his comfort zone. He was having back-to-back meltdowns. He'd strip naked and throw fits. We were in the hotel, and the lock on the hotel at the top of the door, he had jiggled that door so much that he broke that lock off, and the door was coming off the hinges. And my mom had to step out and have a breakdown because she was so worried about him. She had never seen a child behave that way. And then that's when we reached out to a local Dan doctor, Defeat Autism Now, and got him on a diet and supplements. And I'd say within the first 2 weeks of just having him on a gluten, dairy-free diet, cutting sugars, cutting dyes, and then getting those supplements and getting his nourishment correct, thank you, he completely did a 180. And I think other than some delayed speech and the occasional meltdown here and there when he's given gluten, he's pretty much on point now with most 4-year-olds. And I see kids that are still struggling. We've been very lucky to find the support groups that we have and the physicians that we have. Their new PCP is completely on board with us not vaccinating. You know, she agrees. And then the Dan doctor that we see is helping him tremendously.
You're certainly doing very well.
And then we've healed her gut too, and her eczema. She's got some residual eczema a little bit on her legs that kind of come and goes, but for the most part, there's no real permanent damage. I think they're going to live normal lives because we stopped feeding in and started questioning, the medical field altogether. So they're doing really good.
Thank you.
Am I missing something?
That sounds good.
Homeopathy was attracting the most well-known, well-respected literary greats, corporate leaders, and educated people.
The important part is, does the stuff work?
There is strong research evidence demonstrating it works, and yet nobody will believe it.
I wasn't really sure. I was skeptic. When I went to the doctor, he said to me, he goes, "Well, what are you taking? What are you doing? You're way, way better."
Homeopathy will effectively restore health rather than simply put a Band-Aid on their symptoms.
This is the medicine of the future. This is the medicine we've all been waiting for.
This is 21st century medicine.
This and all CHD TV programming is made possible by generous support from viewers like you. Please consider making a contribution today to keep our programming going strong. Thank you.